We just saw a really good example of very, very poorly persisted identities across requests. And in fact, what we saw was that an integer was the only means of sending the identity of the current user when a vote was made. Now, I mentioned tokens a few times, so I want to just recap on what it is about tokens that makes this process much more secure. And to put it in context, let's just look at some of the problems we have with alternate means of identity persistence. So the problem with enumerable IDs is now pretty clear. In the last example we just did, we simply captured a request, and that was the request to vote. We incremented the user ID that was sent with the request by 1, and then just reissued the request. That was it. That entirely circumvented the authorization. So enumerable IDs as a sole means of authorization are absolutely useless. Of course, the other common mechanism we have to persist identities is to literally resend the credentials with every request. Now, this may sound crazy, but again, trust me, it happens. I've seen it, and on many more than just one occasion too. So let's touch on some of the problems we have with sending credentials, that is a username and a password, on every request to an API. Well, firstly, clearly the device must store them in the clear somewhere. Even if it stores it in an encrypted fashion somewhere on the device, obviously the mechanism must exist in order to decrypt those credentials and send them with the request. As soon as that mechanism exists, there is the potential for an attacker who obtains the device to gain access to those credentials. The other thing is that logging on against credentials that are stored securely on the server, that is, there's a strong hashing algorithm for the password, that process should be resource intensive. In my other courses, I've talked at length about strong hashing algorithms as required for password storage, and it always boils down to the fact that a good hashing algorithm needs to be slow enough that it can't be brute forced. So ultimately it does become resource intensive on the server. Now, you don't want a resource intensive process being invoked every single time you make an API request. That's not going to do your scalability any favors whatsoever. Now, some people might argue that sending a token around really just poses the same risks as sending credentials around. If someone can get your token, then they can replay requests in just the same way as they could if they had, say, your username and password. That's not entirely correct, because the reality of it is that you can do a lot more with credentials than what you can with a token. So for example, you can usually log onto someone's account if you have their credentials and change things about their identity. So for example, you could change their email address or even change their password. You could lock them out. That's not something you can normally do with a token alone. In a well-designed system, you should have to provide your password again in order to change your password, or in order to change other attributes like the email address, which could let you do a password reset. You can still do damage with a token, but the scope of damage that can be done with a token is normally constrained to what can be done by invoking the API. The other unfortunate reality with passwords is password reuse. If somebody gets their password compromised, there's every possibility that it will then unlock other accounts the user holds. Tokens are an entirely different story. They're not going to be valid anywhere else. Yes, the disclosure can cause some adverse impacts, but it is limited to the scope of the site that set it. So moving on to tokens, there's a few things that we look for in a token, and I'm going to show you a real-world example of that in just a moment. And firstly, the token should be cryptographically strong. So clearly, it shouldn't be an enumerable ID. That's far from cryptographically strong. It also shouldn't be something that conforms to a predictable pattern, like a global unique identifier. Now in reality, The global unique nature of a GUID makes it rather hard to brute force, but certainly you'll get arguments that any predictable sort of structure is not as secure as a cryptographically random string. Of course, tokens also need to be uniquely identifiable, so you need to be able to take a token from a request and resolve it to an explicit identity on the end of the API. Now, depending on your framework, you will have different constructs available to do that. So do look at the best practices for your server-side development language of choice. And finally, many tokens do also have a limited lifespan. Try logging onto your banking app on your mobile device, capturing the token that's sent with the request, and coming back the next day and using it. It won't work. Hopefully it won't work. And that's a deliberate design to limit the lifespan of the token so that if it is intercepted, it has a very small window of use. Now granted, most applications won't work that way. You wouldn't want your Facebook logging you out every day. But there are certainly cases where a configurable lifespan of a token is very important. The username and password are still valid across much longer periods of time, but after providing them once to authenticate yourself, you have a small window for which the token actually works. So that's a bit of Token 101 and some of the anti-patterns that you find with identity persistence in APIs. Let's now go and take a look at a real-world app and how it's persisting the identity of the user once they log in.